Let me tell you something about the person who walks into a room and knows things they should not know, who reads people with an accuracy that feels supernatural, who picks up on things that most people miss entirely, who seems to operate on a frequency that the majority of people around them cannot access, who has what some call a sixth sense and what others call spiritual intelligence and what the psychology research calls something more specific and more fascinating than either of those labels fully captures. We are going to go into the actual psychology of this. What the research says about how certain minds process information at a depth and with an accuracy that produces what looks, from the outside, like something beyond ordinary human perception. Because here is what the science has found. The abilities that we associate with mentalists, with people of extraordinary perceptual and interpersonal sensitivity, are not supernatural. They are not magical. They are not beyond scientific examination. They are the product of specific psychological and neurological configurations, specific patterns of attention, of sensory processing, of social cognition that exist in some people at a level of development that makes what they do appear inexplicable to the people around them. And spiritual intelligence, the capacity to access meaning, to connect with something larger than the self, to operate with a depth of awareness that transcends the ordinary cognitive categories, has its own psychological architecture that the research has been mapping with increasing precision. That is what we are examining today. Let's start with the mentalist, because this is where the psychology is most specific and most surprising. The stage mentalist, the performer who appears to read minds, to know private information, to detect deception with uncanny accuracy, is not reading minds. Let me be direct about that. The clinical and cognitive psychology research is unambiguous. Genuine telepathy, the direct transmission of thought between minds without sensory mediation, has no scientific support. What the mentalist is doing is something that is, in many ways, more interesting than telepathy. They are reading the extraordinary quantity of information that human beings leak constantly and unconsciously through their behavior, their language, their micro-expressions, and the specific patterns of what they say and do not say. Paul Ekman's decades of research on facial expression and emotion, the foundational work on micro-expressions, documented something that the research has now replicated extensively. The human face produces expressions that reflect emotional states in ways that are partially involuntary. Brief, sub-second expressions that flash across the face before conscious control can suppress them, that are readable to a trained observer but invisible to most people. The skilled mentalist, and the person with what we might call extraordinary interpersonal sensitivity, has developed, through attention and practice, the capacity to read these signals at a speed and an accuracy that most people cannot achieve, not because they have supernatural access to other people's inner states, because they have developed an extraordinary attunement to the information that other people's inner states continuously produce in the physical world. Here is the research that explains why some people are significantly better at this than others. Elaine Aron's research on the highly sensitive person, which we have referenced in multiple previous scripts, is directly relevant here. The neurological trait of sensory processing sensitivity produces a brain that processes incoming sensory and social information more thoroughly than average. More layers extracted, more connections made, more signal detected in what most people experience as noise. The highly sensitive individual in a social environment is not just receiving the same information as everyone else and processing it differently. They are receiving more information. Their nervous system is registering social cues, the micro-expression, the vocal shift, the postural change, the specific quality of a pause, that the neurotypical nervous system filters out as below the threshold of significance. This is the neurological foundation of what presents as unusual interpersonal perception, not supernatural access. Superior signal detection in a domain where most people have significant perceptual gaps. Research by Judith Hall and colleagues on accuracy in interpersonal perception, specifically on what she calls interpersonal sensitivity, identified significant individual differences in the capacity to accurately read other people's emotional states, intentions, and personality characteristics, and found that this capacity was associated with specific attentional and processing characteristics, with a tendency toward careful, thorough observation. with the willingness to update first impressions in response to new information, with the absence of the confirmatory bias that most people bring to social perception. The mentalist and the highly sensitive person are not doing the same thing, but they are drawing on related psychological resources. The skilled observer, the thorough processor, the mind that is genuinely, deeply attending to what is in front of it. Now let me address spiritual intelligence directly, because this is the more complex territory and the one where the psychology research has more recently been developing a serious framework. Howard Gardner, whose multiple intelligences theory we discussed in a previous script, initially proposed existential intelligence as a potential addition to his framework, the capacity to engage with ultimate questions about existence, meaning, mortality, and the nature of reality. The capacity to hold the largest questions with genuine depth and without the need for premature closure. Robert Emmons subsequently developed the concept of spiritual intelligence more formally, proposing it as a distinct form of intelligence characterized by 4 core capacities: the capacity to transcend the ordinary, the ability to enter states of consciousness that extend beyond the conventional categories of everyday experience, not through dissociation or avoidance, through a genuine expansion of the experiential field, the capacity to enter and maintain heightened states of consciousness, what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's research identified as flow states, and what contemplative traditions across cultures identify as states of deep presence, of expanded awareness, of what meditators call mindfulness at its most developed. The research finds is more accessible and more consistently achievable in individuals with high spiritual intelligence. The capacity to invest ordinary experience with a sense of the sacred, to find meaning, depth, and transcendent significance in the texture of everyday experience, rather than requiring extraordinary circumstances to access a sense of connection to something larger than the individual self. And the capacity to engage with spiritual and contemplative practices in ways that produce genuine psychological transformation rather than just intellectual understanding of spiritual concepts. Here is the neuroscience of spiritual experience, because this is the piece that grounds the entire discussion in the research most firmly. Andrew Newberg's neurotheology research, neuroimaging studies of the brain during meditation, prayer, and states of spiritual experience, is among the most important and least publicly discussed contributions to the psychology of spiritual intelligence. Newberg's research found consistent patterns of neural activity associated with states of spiritual experience. Reduced activity in the posterior superior parietal cortex, the brain region responsible for the sense of the boundaries of the self and its distinction from the environment. Increased activity in the prefrontal cortex regions associated with focused attention and the sense of meaning and significance. The reduction in parietal boundary processing is the neurological correlate of what meditators describe as the dissolution of the boundary between self and world. The experience that the individual self is not separate from, but continuous with the larger reality it inhabits. What contemplative traditions across cultures identify as the core mystical experience. This is not supernatural. This is measurable brain activity. But what it produces, the specific quality of consciousness associated with reduced self-other boundary processing, is also not simply ordinary cognition. It is a genuine alteration of the experiential field that produces real psychological consequences, real changes in the relationship with mortality, real changes in the sense of meaning and connection, real changes in the capacity for compassion and for the experience of beauty. The person with high spiritual intelligence is a person who can access these states more readily, more deeply, and with more deliberate intention than the average person. Not because they have a different brain in some categorical sense, because they have developed, through practice, through temperament, through specific life experiences, the specific neural pathways that make these states more accessible. Let me talk about the overlap between the mentalist's perceptual gifts and the spiritually intelligent person's expanded awareness, because this is where the psychology reveals something important. Both profiles share a core characteristic that the research identifies as fundamental to both extraordinary interpersonal perception and to spiritual experience: the capacity for genuine, sustained, non-judgmental, present moment attention. John Kabat-Zinn's foundational work on mindfulness, and the subsequent 3 decades of mindfulness research that has produced some of the most extensively replicated findings in psychology, identifies present moment awareness as a trainable capacity with measurable neurological foundations and measurable psychological consequences. The default mode network, which we have discussed extensively in previous scripts, is the brain's resting state network, the system that generates the internal narrative, the self-referential thinking, the planning and rumination that occupy most people's conscious experience most of the time. The skilled meditator, the person with highly developed spiritual intelligence, and the skilled interpersonal observer, the person with highly developed mentalist capacity. Both show, in different ways, the ability to quiet the default mode network and be genuinely present with what is actually in front of them. For the mentalist, this produces the specific quality of attention that makes the reading of micro-expressions, of vocal patterns, of the subtle signals of concealed emotional states possible. The mind that is not running its own internal commentary is a mind that is actually available to receive the information the environment is producing. For the spiritually intelligent person, this produces the specific quality of awareness that the research on contemplative experience identifies, the sense of presence, of connection, of the ordinary becoming somehow saturated with significance. Both are expressions of the same underlying capacity. The development of attention as a deliberate practice that goes significantly beyond the ordinary functioning of the human mind. Here is the psychological research on what high spiritual intelligence actually produces in a person's life, because this is where the research has the most practically important findings. Lisa Miller's research at Columbia University and her subsequent book, The Spiritual Child, is among the most empirically rigorous examinations of the relationship between spiritual experience and psychological well-being across the lifespan. Miller's research found that individuals with a developed relationship with spiritual experience, defined in terms of personal spirituality rather than religious affiliation, showed significantly better outcomes across multiple measures of psychological well-being. Lower rates of depression, lower rates of substance abuse, greater resilience in the face of adversity, higher levels of meaning and life satisfaction. The research on meaning and mortality, particularly Irvin Yalom's existential psychology framework and the subsequent empirical work on terror management theory by Jeff Greenberg and colleagues, is directly relevant. The person with high spiritual intelligence has a different relationship with the foundational anxiety that the research identifies as underlying much of human psychological difficulty. The anxiety about mortality, about meaninglessness, about the contingency and fragility of the self and its projects. Not because they have found the correct metaphysical answer to these questions, because they have developed a quality of relationship with the questions themselves that does not require resolution, that can hold the uncertainty of existence without being destabilized by it. This is one of the most important psychological capacities the research identifies, and it is one that the contemplative traditions across cultures have been developing methods for cultivating for thousands of years. Here is where I want to land. The psychology of the mentalist and the psychology of the person with high spiritual intelligence are not the same, but they share something that the research finds is among the most rare and most consequential human capacities: the development of attention beyond its ordinary range. The mentalist who reads rooms and people with extraordinary accuracy has developed their attentional capacity in the domain of interpersonal perception. The spiritually intelligent person who accesses states of expanded awareness and operates with a quality of presence that most people describe as profound has developed their attentional capacity in the domain of consciousness itself. Both are doing something that the research consistently finds most human beings are capable of, but almost none have developed. The capacity to be genuinely present, to attend to what is actually there rather than to the internal narrative that runs continuously on top of it. To receive the information that the world is producing, both in the faces and bodies and patterns of other people and in the texture of experience itself, with a depth and an accuracy that ordinary cognition does not reach. This is not supernatural, but it is not ordinary either. It is the product of attention developed beyond its default range, of a relationship with the present moment that most people never develop because the culture they are living in does not teach it, does not reward it, and does not provide the conditions under which it is most likely to grow. The mentalist reads what is there. The spiritually intelligent person is present to what is there. Both are doing something the research finds produces remarkable capacities, and both are pointing toward the same underlying truth, that the ordinary human mind, developed beyond its defaults, contains possibilities that look, from the outside, like something more than ordinary, because they are.